Why does the final boss of Dark Souls sound defeated? For most games, the final battle is the moment where everything escalates. The music becomes louder, the orchestra swells, the choir enters. The player is supposed to feel like they've finally reached the ultimate confrontation. But Dark Souls does something strange. After dozens of brutal encounters, impossible monsters and towering gods, the final boss theme is not triumphant. It is not terrifying. It is not even especially aggressive. Instead, when the player finally meets Gwyn, Lord of Cinder, they hear a lonely piano. Not a choir, not a thunderous percussion, not a heroic anthem, just a fragile melody echoing through a dead world. And that choice completely changes how we understand Gwyn, the ending of Dark Souls, and the entire world that the game has built. Because Gwyn's theme is not a battle music, it is a requiem. Today I want to talk about why Gwyn's music is one of the most important moments in Dark Souls, how it completely recontextualizes the final boss, and why a simple piano piece says more about the game's themes than almost any line of dialogue. By the time the player reaches Gwyn, Dark Souls has trained them to expect a grandeur, right? The game constantly presents its bosses as overwhelming forces. The bell gargoyles are chaotic and aggressive. Ornstein and Smo are accompanied by one of the most intimidating themes in the game. Even bosses with tragic stories, like Artorias, still feel powerful and dangerous through their music. Dark Souls uses orchestral music to communicate scale. Choirs and brass create the feeling that the player is confronting myths. These are not just enemies, they are legends. And Gwyn should be the greatest legend of all. In the lore, he is the ruler of the Age of Fire, the god who defeated the dragons, the king of sunlight, the figure whose actions shaped the entire world. So, naturally, players expect the final battle to feel enormous. But when the fog gate closes behind you, Dark Souls deliberately denies that expectation. The kiln of the first flame is quiet. The world is covered in ash. There are no cheering soldiers, no grand kingdom, no signs of victory. And then the piano begins. The moment is shocking, because the game suddenly stops presenting Gwyn as a god. Instead, it presents him as a dying man. That inversion is the entire point. Most final bosses are designed to feel larger than life. Gwyn's music does the opposite. It strips away the mythology. Before the player even swings their weapon, the soundtrack tells them something important. This is not a glorious final battle. This is the end of something ancient. To understand why the music matters so much, we need to understand Gwyn himself. Long before the events of Dark Souls, the world existed in a great age ruled by immortal dragons. Then the first flame appeared. The flame introduced disparity into the world. Light and dark, life and death, heat and cold. From this flame, powerful beings discovered immense souls. And Gwyn was one of them. Using the power of his Lord Soul, Gwyn led a war against the dragons and helped establish the Age of Fire. He became a godlike ruler and built the kingdom of Honor Londo. But the first flame was never meant to be permanent. Eventually it began to fade. And with the fading of the fire came possibility of a new age. An age of dark. An age associated with humanity rather than gods. And naturally, Gwyn feared this. Rather than allowing the world to change naturally, he chose to sacrifice himself to the flame in order to prolong the Age of Fire. This act transformed him into a Lord of Cinder. By the time the player reaches him, Gwyn is no longer the mighty king described in legends. He is burned out, exhausted, hollow. The great god who once reshaped the world is now little more than a shell endlessly feeding a dying fire. And that is exactly what the music communicates. The soundtrack is not introducing us to Gwyn at his peak. It is mourning what he has become. Now let's talk about the instrument of choice. the piano. This matters because Dark Souls rarely uses piano in this way. Most boss themes rely on a large orchestral arrangements. Heavy percussion, choirs, strings, and brass dominate the soundtrack. These compositions create spectacle. They make bosses feel larger than human. But Gwyn's theme removes almost all of that. The piano is exposed, fragile, human. And because the arrangement is so minimal, every note feels vulnerable. The player is no longer confronting a mythological force. They are confronting the remnants of one. In many ways, the piano functions almost like a narrative reveal. The game spends dozens of hours building Gwyn into an almost divine figure. But the moment the music begins, the illusion collapses. The soundtrack tells the player the truth before the game ever says it directly. Gwyn has already lost. Not physically, but spiritually. The war is over. The kingdom is dead. The fire is fading. And the god who tried to stop that process has sacrificed everything for a world that is already crumbling. The loneliness of the piano reflects the loneliness of Gwyn himself. This is not a music of conquest. It is the music of isolation. What makes Gwyn's theme extraordinary is that it perfectly summarizes the philosophy of Dark Souls. The game is obsessed with decline. Not sudden destruction, but slow erosion. Kingdoms fade, heroes become hollow, legends decay into ruins. Dark Souls constantly asks what happens when an age refuses to die. Gwyn is the embodiment of that question. He could not let go of power. He could not accept the end of the Age of Fire. And in trying to preserve his world forever, he destroyed himself. The music captures all of that tragedy without needing words. This is the brilliance of the composition. It communicates lore emotionally rather than expositionally. Even players who know almost nothing about the story instinctively understand that something is wrong. The sadness of the piano tells them everything they need to know. This is not a victory, this is exhaustion. And that emotional clarity is part of why the ending has remained so iconic. Years later, players may forget specific mechanics or item descriptions, but they remember walking into the kiln and hearing those first piano notes. Because in that moment, Dark Souls reveals what it has truly been about all along. Not power, not destiny, not heroism. Impermanence. So, in conclusion, the Gwyn's theme works because it refuses to give the player the ending they expect. Instead of a final battle anthem, Dark Souls gives us mourning. Instead of portraying Gwyn as an untouchable god, the game presents him as the tragic remains of a dying age. The piano strips away the mythology, and the entire encounter transforms the ending of Dark Souls from a victory into a funeral. That is why the music feels unforgettable. It is not trying to make Gwyn seem powerful. It is trying to make the player understand him. And in doing so, Dark Souls accomplishes something rare. It turns its final boss fight into an act of reflection. By the time Gwyn falls, the player is not celebrating. They are standing among the ashes of a world that has already ended. And the lonely piano reminds us that sometimes the most powerful music in games is not the music of triumph. It is the music of loss. Thanks for watching.